Oldham East and Saddleworth. Tim Stanley, the historian and Telegraph columnist, who isn't quite here yet, but I'm told he is almost here. And Daniel Bruce, Chief Executive of Transparency International. They're here to answer your questions. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. You can text your question to 84850 and you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, let's go to our first caller. It's Martin in Doncaster. Hello, Martin.
Hi, Iain and panel. Yeah, I'd like to ask, would it cause instability and uncertainty for the country if the Conservatives got rid of Boris Johnson?
Andrew Bowie, now you have expressed your disquiet with Boris Johnson, well, certainly before the Ukraine invasion. Did you send a letter in to Sir Graham Brady?
No, I didn't.
Right.
But I think it would cause instability, not just in this country, but actually regarding the situation in Ukraine. I think it would play into Vladimir Putin's hands if Britain was to go down the route of changing leader now. It's at a very pivotal moment in that fight for
But we did say 1916 in the middle of the First World War, in 1940 in the Second World War, the Gulf War, Margaret Thatcher. It's not unprecedented.
It's not unprecedented, but we're in a very different situation. The world is a very different place, and given that Boris Johnson has been leading the global effort to stand up to Russian aggression in Ukraine, I think it would be an act of folly, frankly, for us to engage in that right now. What we need to be doing is focusing on supporting the government and people of Ukraine, and also focusing on the issues that face us right now in this country. And that's what I believe the Prime Minister is doing right now.
I guess you don't, Debbie.
I don't agree, no. Not just the reasons that you've given, Iain, as well. I mean, history has shown that during periods of war, there have been changes of leadership. We're not actually at war at the moment. And one could argue that the Prime Minister's tendency for law breaking, both as an individual but also in terms of a head of government has not provided the best example to people like Putin, that he can do whatever he wants, walk into a sovereign nation and claim it there as their territory.
There is some difference between having to pay a fixed penalty fine and invading a sovereign country and committing war crimes, Debbie. I think to compare the two is slightly crass.
Well, my point is that he's not necessarily known for his law-abiding behaviour, and I do not think that this is what the country deserves at this moment in time. The country deserves far better than this.
But Andrew's got a point, hasn't he? Because Vladimir Putin has already nicknamed Boris Johnson public enemy number one in Russia. He'd be rather pleased if Boris Johnson went. Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that there are a lot of things that Putin has said with rhetorical undertones, but I really do think that we need to look at the type of leaders that we have in the country, and not just in the country but in the world. And surely the rule of law, a rules-based system, is something that we should be saying is really, really important, and the likes of Putin and others who seem that to just ignore that, it's not a good precedent.
But Martin's question was, would it cause any instability if we got rid of Boris Johnson right now? I mean, inevitably, if you get rid of a Prime Minister, that does create instability of some sort, doesn't it?
It would do, potentially on a temporary basis. But are we saying that seriously? Are we saying that this is all the country has to offer? Somebody that is.
If you say on a temporary basis, I mean, what would happen if Boris Johnson were to resign or be pushed out right now would be that the Conservative Party would have to engage in a leadership election. And we saw the last time the leadership election for leadership of this party took place over a period of a month and a half. And I don't think, frankly, that our allies would be very happy.
So when is a good time, Andrew? When is a good time? When we have got an absolute chaotic government at the moment. We have got a cost of living crisis which the government seem incapable of dealing with. People are having to decide between heating and eating.
Which is exactly the reason that we should be focusing on dealing with those issues and not engaging in a process of navel-gazing and infighting that the Conservative Party would undoubtedly go into, whether they were to go into a leadership election.
What about the Spring Statement? An opportunity for you to have done something, or the Chancellor to have done something about the appalling budget that he was going to introduce. All it was a £1 give back.
That's not true. The Spring Statement unveiled a whole raft of measures in which we're tackling the cost of living crisis.
Out of the £6 that they cut.
The 5p cut in fuel duty.
£1 in every six.
Let's not go back in history too much here. Let's bring our other two panellists in. Daniel Bruce from Transparency International. Again, the question, would it cause instability if we got rid of Boris Johnson?
The thing is, if you think about Partygate, on its own, this is something which has been dragging on in the public realm for
and will continue
months and months now, and will. And I would contend that is a consequence of instability and chaos in our standards regime, and it's because we're at a point of acute stress for this conventions-based approach to the oversight of behaviour and standards for our elected representatives up to the Prime Minister, for ministers and members of Parliament across the board. And what we would like to see any occupant of number 10 do is take seriously the whole raft of policy recommendations and changes that would put those conventions-based rules at the moment onto a statutory footing, which has been recommended by the Committee on Standards in Public Life, headed by a former head of MI5. These are not just Daniel Bruce's ideas from Transparency International. And actually, if we have a reset of how standards and behaviour are overseen, I think that has to be the step forward that is taken.
But we have overseers at the moment, don't we? How would that change anything?
We have an independent advisor to the Prime Minister on ministerial
standards. And we have the Common Standards Committee.
Who is not independent. And there is the Common Standards Committee, but we're talking here, let's talk about the Ministerial Code. The Ministerial Code, there's been a lot of debate about whether or not the Prime Minister willfully misled Parliament under the Ministerial Code. The Ministerial Code also places an obligation on all ministers to obey the law. And so the question that's really troubling me at the moment is, if another minister was found to be, or suspected of being, in breach of the code which is owned by the Prime Minister, the code of which the Prime Minister is the arbiter, could the Prime Minister look that minister in the face and say, I'm terribly sorry, you'll have to resign?
Tim Stanley.
Hello. I'm sorry I'm late.
No, not at all.
I've come from Ukraine.
Well,
I really have.
For those of you who are watching, I've never seen Tim Stanley unshaven before. It's quite a sight.
I have come from Ukraine, and I thought I'd better have a shower before I came here. So
We're so glad you did.
I really had to brush off a lot. I think Partygate's ridiculous. You could argue that we've got chaos anyway. And we're going to continue to have chaos because it's out of the hands of Boris Johnson. It's in the hands of the police, Sue Gray, and the opposition, and the media, who will keep on going back to Partygate so long as it's a live story, and it ain't going to go away because there are countless times in which he is alleged to have broken the rules that can be constantly dredged up. On the other hand, if you did suddenly get rid of him, well, we've had times in the past where actually the changeover leaders has been quite smooth. One thinks of David Cameron. There was a week of Andrea Leadsom versus Theresa May, but then the Tory party very quickly realised, no, it's got to be Theresa May. And they came around her. A leader can arise.
That worked out well.
She wasn't the best pick, but nonetheless, the point is, as a mechanism, sometimes the Tory party is very good at replacing people like that. But the question was asked, is this really all that politics has got to offer, all the country's got to offer? Yes, I'm afraid it is. There really isn't anyone right now on the front bench who would be at least superior to Boris Johnson, or probably equal to him and the task that he faces. But also, Labour's not terribly impressive either, I'm sorry to tell you, as Keir Starmer cannot compete with Boris Johnson when it comes to charisma, and we'll see what happens in the local elections. But I don't really feel that there is anyone out there right now who is offering that potent mix of stability and charisma.
I think that's what they said about Angela Merkel, though. She was one of the most stable and decent politicians that we have.
In retrospect, she was a disaster.
Well, her legacy is really unravelling, isn't it?
There are the two sides.
Pick another one.
Gerhard Schroeder.
Can I just pick up on Daniel's point about the ministerial code, because that's something that both all the nation states rather is underpinned by statute. So it's underpinned by the Nolan principles and by statute. So it's not left to people in the House of Commons to decide what happens. And that's a major flaw in the...
Is it? Why?
Yes. Because it then means that there isn't, as Daniel has just said, in terms of the Prime Minister being the final arbiter. I have tried since beginning of last year, when the Prime Minister quite clearly misled the House of Commons in terms of response he gave to me, saying that the government hadn't had published all of the PPE contracts. Well, they hadn't. The High Court said they hadn't, and he still failed to correct the record. So I went to speak to Lord Evans, who's the chair of the Public Standards Committee. There was absolutely nothing we could do. So when we said that, there's, nothing will change, something could change if we manage to get a change in the ministerial.
Would you be in favour of that, Daniel?
We favour putting the ministerial code onto a statutory footing, absolutely. And, that is one of 34 recommendations that the Committee on Standards in Public Life made in November last year. The government response at the time was, we will respond in due course. Essentially, this is not urgent. 2 days later, we had the Owen Paterson affair in the House of Commons, when apparently suddenly there was an urgent need to reform the oversight of the MP's standards regime. And I would note that, again, Lord Evans and his committee found that was one of the areas less in need of reform that was working more effectively. So there needs to be an evidence-based approach to policy making on these issues around standards and probity at the heart of those who are in the most senior roles in public office.
Right, well, we're going to come to more of your questions in just a moment. Let's, before we do, though, come back to Martin in Doncaster. What's your own answer to your own question, Martin?
I think people have had enough. We've had Donald Trump in charge of America, causing chaos all over the world. We've had Brexit, the fallout from all of that for 4 years. We've had the pandemic, and even though I think Boris Johnson's done a good job with the Ukraine, we deserve a leader, we deserve a Prime Minister who we can trust in the country, and we haven't got it, I think.
You want somebody who's a bit dull, don't you?
No, just somebody, I've never voted Conservative, but I trust people like Ben Wallace. And people like that, and and people have lost trust in Boris Johnson, and we've had enough. We deserve better. I say, even though he's done a good job in Ukraine, we need somebody who we can trust in this country.
All right, thank you, Martin. Joe in Putney says, who cares about charisma? Tim, you were mentioning charisma. I've written a piece for your newspaper tomorrow, slightly about this, talking about Jeremy Hunt, wondering if Boris Johnson does go for whatever time, whether this could be the time for Jeremy Hunt. He has first-hand experience in government. He would be seen as a sort of trusted figure, I think, by many people. Not necessarily the most charismatic candidate. That's partly why he didn't win against Boris Johnson. Yes. But there might be a lot to be said for that.
There might be. I want to know where he stands on issues, though. And I think there's a bigger long-term problem for the Conservatives than Partygate or Boris Johnson's reputation, and that is the perception that they have lost their way among their core voters, be it the Red Wall, who supposedly uniformly want Conservative populism, or be the traditional Tory heartlands that want a few tax cuts. You're not getting any of that, really, from this government right now, and I think there's going to be an ideological contest when Johnson goes. There's going to be someone who challenges from the right, who says we've lost our way on national insurance and things like that. There's going to be someone who says, no, we need to be more one nation and reach out again to people in the middle. I think you need to have that, because I think there needs to be a greater definition of what the Conservative Party actually stands for. Because right now it does feel a little bit like the Boris Johnson party. And he's very good at parties. He likes a party. But there's a lot of that which I find very appealing, but they've got to have a shelf life beyond Boris Johnson's leadership.
Right, well, in a moment we'll find out if it's Debbie Abrahams' fault that Oldham Athletic have been relegated from the Football League. Stand by your beds, it's 8:15.
LBC.
This is
Fans Conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
17 minutes past 8. Lots of support for Dominic Raab and Penny Mordaunt on our texts and tweets, it has to be said, for what it's worth. With us in the studio, Andrew Barry, Conservative...
I'm pleased to hear Dominic Raab is listening.
or his mum, one or the other. Andrew Barry, Conservative MP, Debbie Abrahams, Labour MP for Oldham East and Saddleworth, Tim Stanley, historian and Telegraph columnist, and Daniel Bruce, Chief Executive of Transparency International UK. Now, before we go back to your calls, Darren Radcliffe on Twitter says, Iain, as a West Ham fan and having our local MP on, would you be able to discuss the plight of Oldham Athletic FC with Debbie? She's expressed solidarity with our fans who now support the first Premier League team to drop down to non-league. Would be good to know what she's done about things. Well, apart from get on the pitch and score a few goals for them, I'm not sure what you can do.
No, I've met with both the official supporters a number of times with both Jim and Ange, because obviously the three Oldham MPs. The Boundary Park's actually in Jim's constituency. We have also been working with the council to see, what deals we could do to try and help them in terms of some of the profitability. I asked a question in the statement today, and I was quite forthright. Really, we've got a difficult owner, put it that way.
Is that not about to change?
Hopefully it will.
I've been listening to the Price of Football podcast a lot, so I know a little bit about what's going on.
Hopefully it will, but that has been absolutely the core issue. Staff haven't been paid, all sorts of very concerning rumours. The official supporters, and then there are another number of offshoots as well who are just desperate. This is, they're so committed to the club, and it really is disappointing. So as much as I do welcome the review, Andrew, to have another white paper after Tracy's done such a grand job with this fan-led review, it's disappointing. It seems to be kicking it further down.
Well, they have accepted all of her recommendations, haven't they?
I know, but it's going to be another...
But that's how legislation works.
Yeah, the white paper will be produced. We've accepted all of Tracy's recommendations. I think it's really positive. Not that it will affect my club, who are sitting 4 points off a relegation playoff place in the Scottish Premier League. But I think having more...
Who's that?
Aberdeen. Right. I think having more fan involvement in the running of clubs is a very, very good thing. Not that I think it will, sadly, that it'll have much impact for the situation that Oldham find themselves in right now. Yeah. They've accepted all of Tracy's recommendations. Tracy, works incredibly hard to come up with her review, and this is, as Iain says, how legislation works.
She did say the same thing in terms of, we would like to push it on a little bit quicker than this, and to make sure that, for example, the white paper is published well before the summer recess.
Right. I think we should move on, but I can't let this go without mentioning Oldham's 6-0 victory up against West Ham on that awful plastic pitch that you used to have. Right, let's go to Sophie in Kingston. Sophie, what's your question, please?
Oh, hello, Iain. Thank you
for
taking my call. Yes, I'm a retired registered nurse, and I've got an old picture of myself as a student nurse sitting in the front row because I was only 5'2", with my knees and legs showing. The whole front row had their knees and legs showing.
Outrageous, Sophie.
As student nurses in the 1970s. My question is, I'm utterly devastated and deplored at how Angela Rayner has been depicted, and I just want to know the panel's view.
Tim Stanley, you're the only full-time, I say full-time journalist, you're a historian as well, so I'll say part-time journalist among us. First of all, are you familiar with this story, having only got back from Ukraine?
Oh, they were talking about nothing but. I thought, when I heard that someone was accused of showing off their legs in Parliament, I thought it was Stephen Kinnock. Because he wears these very tight trousers that often ride up his calves. Whenever he stands up to make a point, they're sort of halfway up his legs, and he spends a lot of time trying to pull them down again, and it's incredibly distracting. So I thought it's all about him, but it's not, is it?
New one on me.
Isn't this an old story?
No.
I thought this was an old story that's being dredged up again.
No, not at all. An anonymous Tory MP briefed the Mail on Sunday that Angela Rayner supposedly puts off Boris Johnson by showing, whatever.
But Boris Johnson has said that this is nonsense. It's not come from him.
It has to be nonsense. You've stood at the front bench, well, both of you have, and I don't think you can actually see the other person below about here.
No, but Angela was sitting down, so that was the point. And I know we've just had a bit of a chuckle about how Tim has framed that response, but this is a serious issue. I'm sorry, as the only woman on the panel, I'm telling you this is a really serious issue, and the fact that it's happened in a mainstream media and
a newspaper which prides itself on appealing to women.
Well, absolutely. It's very, very well. I mean, this is, I have to say, not nearly as bad as you get on social media. So this is absolutely horrific. Yeah. I know there's been some calls for the journalist to actually be sacked and so on. What about the editor? Who decided that should go on? It's absolutely shocking.
Shocking. And I think Sophie's absolutely right to be appalled, and everybody across the political divide is disgusted, and it has been condemned.
But one of your colleagues briefed the newspaper on this.
Yes, and they should be held accountable for doing that. I mean, if it's ever discovered who that individual was. But frankly, I think it's down to all of us who are decent, well-meaning politicians, and everybody in the public sphere to call this out for what it was, and it was gross misogyny, and it shouldn't have happened. It shouldn't have been written about in the way that it was. And I think everybody from the Prime Minister down has, pledged solidarity with Angela Rayner for the way that she's been treated this weekend.
But what about the hate crime that should have been? We tried to get through a hate crime, making misogyny a hate crime, and the government refused. Isn't this? It's all warm words and so on. But at the end of the day, half of the population are subjected to this type of behaviour on a daily basis, and it's just it needs to stop. Yeah,
I agree, it needs to stop, and misogyny should be called out wherever it is found to be that in Parliament, be that in any other workplace, and it is right that it has been done so in this case.
Daniel Bruce, let me play devil's advocate. Given that you're from Transparency International, presumably you would defend the journalist's right to publish a story when he'd been told this by a Conservative MP.
Is it a story, though? Is it really?
Well, I think if an elected politician says this sort of thing to a journalist, the journalist could argue, that is a legitimate story.
Did said journalists give Angela Rayner the right of reply? I'm not sure that they did. I'm almost loath to kind of be part of the oxygen that's surrounding this piece of commentary because of what it is. But again, I come back to, my earlier points around, I see the Prime Minister's come out very strongly this afternoon to say that, he would deal incredibly firmly with the MP who is behind this if they were to be found out. I refer to my earlier remarks about, how he can do that given the state of the standards regime.
Well, quite easy. He could withdraw the whip from the MP if we ever found out who it was, which we won't.
But again, we've got to have consistency in the application of standards, and I think this is where the wheels really start to come off the bus. But all of this distracts from the policy agenda, and I say this from a completely apolitical standpoint, as is our organisation's position. But Angela Rayner, along with a whole number of MPs of varying complexions across the House, have been rightfully proponents of the need to change the standards and integrity regime, as I was talking about earlier, and have really owned this issue on a cross-party basis for many months now. And those are the things which are important to our democracy. Those are the sort of things that actually make us the country that we say we are when we're trying to take on Putin's Russia, not journalism about somebody's legs.
Debbie, as the only female representative on this panel, have you experienced this sort of misogyny in your political career?
I have, unfortunately, yes. I mean, it's a few years ago, but I have. I was alerted to somebody had clipped a video of me in the chamber, and it was not very pleasant, and it was sensationalist, and it was made me feel a little bit creepy that somebody had gone to. So that's the.
Do you remember when Jackie Smith first became Home Secretary and she appeared at the dispatch box with a slightly low-cut top on, and she was dubbed by one newspaper, I don't know which one it was, the Minister for Melons. Now, the newspaper did it, presumably, because they thought it was funny. Now, I have to say, I don't think that would happen nowadays.
No, I don't think
so. You could argue that there's been progress of sorts, but clearly not enough.
No, definitely not enough. We think about the stuff that Diane Abbott's been subjected to. It really is, and it's putting women off entering into politics. And it gets back to the point that Daniel's making about what type of country do we want that's and the culture of our politics, where our leaders should be the best of us in terms of what we expect, and the integrity and honesty that we should be expecting our leaders that just aren't. And this is just...
But Tim, if this... I can't imagine, obviously, this happening in the Telegraph, but what processes do stories go through before somebody sort of says, I'm not sure whether we should be doing this?
Well, there's a taste test, an editorial taste test, but of course you've also usually got to confirm a story. You wouldn't just publish one claim like that. And so I'd be surprised if this... I don't know how this came to be, but I'm surprised this wasn't run by someone else. And as I say, it may well fail the taste test. And look, I think it's rude. I think it's surreal. I find the story very hard to sort of process. But what is it we're asking for here? Do you want it to be illegal to publish things like that?
I mean,
is that what we... I mean, because the tone of the conversation is the MP should be kicked out of Parliament and the newspaper shouldn't be allowed to publish.
No, nobody's ever said that. I certainly would believe...
but where is this all going?
Well, the process of education, the fact that women are equal.
But we're doing it. A stupid story's been run. It was rude and unpleasant. Everyone's condemned it, including the Prime Minister. The Tory MP will probably end up losing the whip or something. Doesn't the system work?
Well, I would say...
What more do you want?
Well, if it keeps repeating, obviously it's not.
I think what we need to do is have a wider debate about misogyny in public life.
Do we?
Yeah, I do.
have it all the time. We're having it right now.
Debbie's story. Well, we are having it right now, and maybe this, as uncomfortable and unpalatable as this weekend was for many people, maybe this was the kickstart to this conversation that we required. I mean, Debbie's story there is one of many that so many of my female colleagues could tell. Exactly the same happened to a very good friend of mine in the House of Commons, and indeed happens across the public sphere. So maybe we do have to have this conversation. I do agree we need to be very careful about moving down the route of telling newspapers what can and what cannot be published. I do not think that's somewhere where we, in this country, where we celebrate a free press, should be moving towards. But a return to civility in public discourse would, I think, be at least a step in the right direction, and a recognition that women across the board in Parliament and indeed in public life are subject to the most gross abuse online and in print.
But I think that the civility is under attack from both sides. Today, a member of the Labour front bench said in the Home Office questions that the Tories have given up on law and order. The Tories have given up on victims. This was in the context of a discussion about rape. And she said, and it was because the Prime Minister breaks the law.
Yeah, well, that's wrong and unacceptable.
That's uncivil.
Yes.
There are some forms of incivility. Almost every week now, the Prime Minister gets up and his entire private life is raked over by the Labour front bench in the most unpleasant and personal terms. I don't like that. I don't like what's been done to Angela Rayner. It just feels to me like we allow ourselves to be directed, our rage and outrage and disgust to be directed at certain people on certain sides, but other people...
No, not at all. I mean, I chair the APP Achieving Compassionate Politics, which is about changing the culture in politics so that it is more civil, that it is more respectful in the chamber and outside, so that we do try to be the leaders that we should be. And it should be that's an all-party group. We're members across the piece. We politics and politicians is at an all-time low. Confidence if we've seen what's happened in France with the lowest turnout since 1960.
We might come on to that.
But this is we are going to get the likes of Putin, the likes of Le Pen, of Trump and others. I know that might not be popular, Tim, but we are going to get the likes of these leaders who are very divisive.
You nearly said Boris Johnson then, didn't you? And you stopped yourself.
We're going to get these leaders who don't bring the country together, who don't represent the best, who are the lawbreakers. Why as was it Martin right at the beginning who said, well, why should we be obeying the laws if the people that are making them are doing what they want. Why should there be two sets of rules?
Right, well, Sophie and Kingston, I hope you think you got your money's worth there. Thank you very much for your question. We'll come to more in just a moment. 0345 6060 973. It is 8:32 and Helen Hoddinott has the LBC News headlines.
It's been announced Elon Musk has agreed a deal to buy Twitter for £34.5 billion. The move will shift control of the social media platform populated by millions of users and global leaders to the world's richest person. The Commons Speaker has summoned the editor of the Mail on Sunday to discuss an article about Deputy Labour leader Angela Rayner. Comments made by an anonymous Conservative MP accusing her of trying to distract the Prime Minister in Parliament have been called sexist. And a man in his late 20s is being questioned over the deaths of 4 people stabbed in southeast London. Emergency services were called to Bermondsey just after 2 a.m. this morning. LBC weather mostly clear tonight after some showers. Cloudier in northern Scotland with patches of rain, lows of 1 degree.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
It's 8:36 on LBC. We have Andrew Bowie, Debbie Abrahams, Tim Stanley and Daniel Bruce with us answering your questions. Let's go to a text question from Simon in Brixton. Is the re-election of Emmanuel Macron positive for the UK? Tim?
Well, it's probably more positive than the alternative.
By the way, he's just been re-elected.
No, I caught that. I caught that. I think there was probably a sigh of relief in Ukraine, actually. Yes, it's more positive. Of course, there is a difference with Britain. Macron's big agenda is to beef up Europe, centralise it, empower it so that it can become a vehicle for French greatness. And in the sense that Britain has any tensions with Europe, that is a problem. Mm-hmm. Nonetheless, he is a centrist, economically neoliberal, pro-globalization, slightly deregulating, slightly tax-cutting leader in the classical liberal mould. And this is his second and final term. He may well be ready to do business with Britain. So
do they have to give up after 2 terms in France?
If there's a 2-term limit, right. I think. Am I wrong?
Now you're doubting
Now
yourself.
I'm doubting
I'm
myself.
doubting it as well. I thought so, but now that Ian's asked the question,
If you know the answer, 84850
He'll
on
be
the
very
text.
young. He could do it again because he's only he's only about 42 or 43.
Yeah, much younger than his wife.
Yes. Well,
Ian.
Was that a bad thing
Yes,
to
it
say,
was.
Debbie?
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, as soon as I said it, I regretted it. Can I apologise to the entire nation for that remark?
your most basic instincts took over.
Oh, Daniel Bruce. Nobody else got that joke apart from you and me. Daniel.
It's interesting, isn't it? I think if you look at the people who voted for Le Pen, and whilst Macron has won, that is still a significant amount.
Well, her vote went
of
up by
sentiment.
9%.
Absolutely, a significant amount of sentiment for what one might call a nationalist agenda, which is language that she prefers to far right. But I think you could justifiably put Le Pen in that sort of bucket of populist, aspiring populist leaders or populist candidates that we've seen in other countries around the world. And I do think that some of the approaches that the evidence is telling us we're seeing elsewhere really underscores the threat that they pose to sort of global stability and democracies. And there is a lot of academic writing around the threat of state capture. And this is often where you have one of these populist regimes gets into power with a perfectly legitimate democratic mandate, and then over time they start to dismantle the checks and balances around electoral law, around the independence of the media, around the sort of transparency and accountability.
You're thinking of anyone in particular?
Well, actually, look at Brazil, look at Hungary,
okay.
right? But there are parallels between those narratives, and I think it's just something that we have to be alive to in our political discourse.
But aren't all politicians populist to some degree? Because they have to be popular to get elected in the first place.
I think one of the things that defines a populist movement is it has a very narrow interest group. So it's often a sort of one or two sort of policy, sort of ultra-nationalist narrative, which is slightly different than wanting to be popular with a wide range of different policies. So there is a bit of a threat there. I'd just like to say on Macron, though, that my colleagues at Transparency International France managed to solicit a commitment in 2017 to an 11-point anti-corruption strategy for France, which he promised to implement. He didn't, and he didn't reply to their messages in this election campaign. So we as a movement were a little disappointed.
First rule of candidates: never reply to questionnaires to make commitments. I mean, I'm sure you would never do that, Andrew.
Never reply to any questionnaires ever. No, full stop. In terms of the original question, yeah, I think in comparison to Marine Le Pen, as Tim has said, it's a very, it is what it is. It's a much more positive situation than a Marine Le Pen presidency would be in terms of Franco-British relations, which have not been at an all-time high in recent years. That's fair to say. But in terms of somebody that we can do business with, in terms of somebody that recognises the rule of law, the international community that's willing to work with global partners for bigger aims, I think, yeah, on the whole, it is a positive development.
Debbie.
Yes, no, I'd agree. With everything that's been said, I think his result was really a question. It's not Le Pen, and that's why.
But 42% of the French people who voted, I mean, it was a low turnout, as you said, 42% voted for a far-right candidate. Now, if that happened in this country, I mean, that would be the big story, but it isn't.
Indeed, and the point that I made earlier, when we were seeing the rise of the populist leaders, and they use very similar tactics in terms of very, very divisive, a nationalist agenda and so on, anti-establishment, anti-rules, and talking about the stability and the instability that this creates, going back to the first question, we cannot underestimate it in terms of the global significance. As I was going to go on to say, it will be interesting to see how his parliamentary elections go next. Is it next week? Next
2 weeks.
2 weeks. So,
and I think one of the most under-discussed elements of the entire French election has been the complete collapse in support of the two traditional parties, the Conservatives' sister party, the Republicans, and the Social Democrats over there, who had their worst election results ever in the history of the Fifth Republic, and that's something that's not being discussed, and it'll be very interesting to see how they perform in the Parliament.
It's the equivalent of the Conservatives and Labour getting 7% of the vote between them in this country.
I mean, that's remarkable.
You just can't imagine
and it's not being talked about over here.
No.
That's something that I think is very interesting.
Right, let's move on to James in Hitchin, who's got a very, very up-to-the-minute question. James, go ahead. Hello.
Good evening. Yes, Elon Musk has now bought Twitter. Is this a good thing for its users?
Daniel Bruce, you must know a lot about this.
I think it's far too early to tell if it's a good thing for its users, but actually Andrew and I were discussing this outside earlier. I mean, we agree that this is a phenomenally simple transaction for a phenomenally large amount of money for a company whose asset is what? It is data. It is our data. It is the insights into our lives and interests and the way that we spend our money. That is the fundamental asset. We get it for free as its users, which means that we are ultimately the product. So this has all happened very quickly, hasn't it? There's been some sort of toing and froing over the last few weeks and months. And from a regulatory perspective, it just seems worryingly simple that an asset of that sort of globally momentous nature could just change hands so quickly with relatively little oversight. So I think there has to be a debate around that, and there has to be a continuing debate around the very difficult relationship between national legislation around the world and the oversight and policing of the digital Wild West. This country is making some progress with the online harms bill, but there's a lot in there which is very subjective in terms of interpretations of duty of care for social media companies and so on. And if you look at some of the fines that are proposed, are they just the cost of doing business when you're looking at the volume of money that I understand Twitter has changed hands for this evening? So there's a long way to go on this, I think.
Big question, should he allow Donald Trump back onto Twitter?
Twitter has its own policies and it can revisit them at any time it likes.
No, but what's your opinion?
No, I'm going to pass on that because I think that,
You can't pass on that. I mean, seriously. I mean, I thought that it was... I mean, I'm no fan of Trump by any stretch of the imagination, but I thought it was absolutely reprehensible that a platform that is supposedly in favour of free speech deplatforms the elected president of the United States. They, funnily enough, haven't done it to President Xi or Vladimir Putin.
No, and I think that is the issue. There is, there's got to be consistency in the application.
So I ask you again, what's your view?
Rules. I think they need to look at it again.
That's as much as I'm going to get, I think. Debbie.
Yes, I mean, I don't know enough about the deal and what it involves, but from the perspective of the online safety bill, I was on the joint, at the pre-legislative scrutiny committee on that, and my views will be very much coloured in terms of how he welcomes that or not. The bill itself is a step forward. It doesn't address all the issues. So, for example, thinking about disinformation, which President Trump was very good at supporting, and how the different platforms, particularly Facebook, I have to say, just encourages it because it's, their whole business model, the same with Twitter, but to a lesser extent, the whole business model is about engagement. So you keep people engaged regardless of what you're feeding them, and so there's a lot that still needs to be done on that.
Very brief answers, if we can, from Andrew and Tim.
Yeah, I just think it underlines the Wild West that is the regulation of the online space. And for a company that allows governments, public influencers, anybody involved in opinion forming to be taken over in such a quick period of time with so little regulatory oversight, I think is actually quite scary and demonstrates just how much work needs to be done in terms of looking at the online sphere and what we need to do to make sure it's a safe space to operate on.
Tim?
I'm sure that in decades past we'd have been talking about Maxwell taking over a newspaper or Randolph Hearst and saying, is it good to have one man having such an extraordinary influence in the media? So in some ways things never change. I just think if the figure I've heard, $43 billion, if that's correct, I think that's an astonishing sum of money for a big pile of magic beans. At least those newspapers were print. At least they had plant and they had men who worked in it and men and women who worked in it and things like that. Whereas what are you buying with Twitter? You're buying my tweets. And by the way, it's probably to Donald Trump's advantage not to be on Twitter, because he seems more of a statesman when you can't hear him than when he tweeted.
Good news for you. You were right about Macron only being able to have 2 terms. The French constitution was amended in 2008.
It used to be 7 years.
Yeah, it did. Yeah, absolutely.
It's extraordinary.
And a text here from Dan in Galston. He says, "Good evening. Just a quick question for Andrew. Does he still play the violin? He was very good back in the day."
Not as often as I'd like. Yes, and I'm not as good as I used to be either.
It's 8:47.
LBC, Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Weekday mornings from 7.
Labour MP and Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves joins me now. Do you agree with Jacob Rees-Mogg that staff now, wherever possible, should be back behind their desks?
I think there's sort of bullying behaviour from the Brexit minister that says that people have got to be at their desks every day of the week and for every hour. You know, it's very old-fashioned.
How is it fair that the cleaners and the security guards turn up, but the bosses don't have to? That can't be right.
We've got to get a balance right, and I think that you can attract some really good people if you have a flexible workplace.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
10 to 9, Andrew Bowie, Debbie Abrahams, Tim Stanley and Daniel Bruce with me. Tim, you've just come back from Ukraine. Why were you there in the first place?
I always wanted to go when the conflict broke out, and I wanted to go in the early part of it, but then I caught COVID, so I couldn't. I sort of had this desire to be with those people, and I had to find a good reason. And Easter was the reason, because I don't know much about global politics, but I do know about religion. So I decided to go over the Easter weekend to witness Orthodox and Greek Catholic Easter and write.
Why is their Easter a week behind ours?
Because they operate on the Julian rather than the Gregorian calendar. They have 2 different calendars. There are 2 different calendars for organising these things.
And what did you learn that you didn't know before?
I learned what life is like in wartime, which is a mixture of frightening and banal. It's quite boring. So Lviv is under a curfew after 11, lights out, windows shut, and then air raid sirens go off and people go into the bunker. And of course, sitting in a bunker for several hours is a combination of frightening and boring. And that's what war is, waiting for the bombs that will hopefully never come. When they do come, moment of grand.
And Lviv is seen as one of the safer areas, but there have been attacks, haven't they?
They have, on infrastructure.
Yeah.
So you can pretty safely guess where it is they're going to hit. But I wouldn't put it past Putin, if things get much worse, to start targeting civilians.
Well, as if by magic, we have a question on Ukraine. It's from Kim in Nottingham, who says, Putin bombed some more Ukrainian train stations today. We're just getting used to seeing these things, aren't we? How do we stop ourselves being desensitised to it? It's a really good question, isn't it? Tim?
But then people living through it, I wouldn't say are desensitised to it, but it becomes part of normal life. If you think about what life must have been like during the Blitz, it is, as I say, it's that combination of terror and banality that after a while it becomes part.
But when you see the pictures on your television screens every night, obviously they're different, but they're the same in some ways. And after a time, it's quite difficult, I think, particularly for TV stations, to try and cover the conflict in a way that will keep the attention of the viewers, because we lose attention very quickly, don't we?
Yes, and there can be a temptation to actually go the other way and be hyperbolic and to, for instance, present all of Ukraine, which is an enormous country, as though it's all under constant attack, and it's really not. I mean, the big story in Lviv really isn't military conflict. It's internal displacement and the movement of people. Everyone from the east is moving into Lviv. Much of Lviv has moved out, particularly women and children, into Poland. That's a big humanitarian challenge that the West will eventually have to help with when it comes to reconstruction. So if all your images are coming from the east, I'm not saying that it's a mistake or it's a bad thing, but it can give a misrepresentation of what daily life is like for people living in the western part of the country.
Debbie Abrams.
Remind me.
The question is...
How do you not become desensitised?
Yeah, exactly.
First of all, you don't watch too much of it, so I restrict myself to one broadcast news a day. Otherwise, it becomes too much, and that's all you think. You go to bed thinking about it, you wake up thinking about it, and that can affect people in a negative way and almost prevent you from acting. We've been really lucky, and loads of people in Oldham and Saddleworth have offered providing accommodation for Ukrainians and other refugees, such as from Afghanistan as well. But it's with all wars. We've still got Afghanistan, we've still got Yemen, we've still got Syria.
So there's this phenomenon now that's being described as war anxiety, where the more you see, the more you fear that it's going to come to you. Yeah. And particularly there was all of these sort of thoughts earlier on in the conflict that Putin might use the nuclear button. And I think people were getting very anxious about that happening with this country. Daniel?
I think look at what you can do. It's been really inspiring, hasn't it, to see all of the sort of community organisation that we've seen in the UK in response to this. And politically, there's more that we can do too. We were really pleased that the government moved ahead with the Economic Crime Act, which has some essential tools to deal with dirty Russian money connected to the Kremlin, connected to corruption in Russia here in the UK. That still needs to go further with a second outing of that bill, which will deal with, for example, the use and abuse of companies' house, where the minute I could set up a company, call myself Mickey Mouse and say that my birthday was next September, nobody would check that information, and that's become a real conduit for Russian money connected to the Kremlin finding its way into the economy. So we've got more still to do here, and these can sound like terribly technical legislative things, but actually, if you care, write to your elected representatives about this, ask them what they're going to do about it, keep the momentum up that we had around the economic sanctions, as well as the sort of military assistance as well, and that I think needs to come from individuals as well as our political leaders.
Andrew?
Yeah, I think it's dreadfully sad, but the nature of these conflicts is that people do become desensitised, and it does drop out of the news. We saw it with Vietnam in the 70s, and more recently we saw it with Iraq and Afghanistan, even when we had troops from this country dying on the front line. It wasn't in the news, and it wasn't being discussed by the British people in a way that it probably should have been. And we are, of course, seeing that now in Ukraine, and that's where our role as representatives, as elected representatives, comes into play, because it's up to us to make sure that we continue to talk about it in Parliament, that the issues that are being raised by Putin's blatant breach of international laws continues to be discussed, and that we keep the pressure on the international community to maintain their pressure on Vladimir Putin and their support for the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people, because it is just sadly the nature of these things that it does drop down the news agenda and people do become desensitised. So we've got work to do in the weeks and months to come to ensure that in Parliament at least we are still focused on this, and therefore the government's focus is still very much on doing what it can to support the Ukrainian people.
Right, final question from Carol in Richmond. Are you on Team Jacob or Team Nadine? Is Jacob Rees, there's a choice for you, is Jacob Rees-Mogg right to be intimidating civil servants into getting back into the office? He's been leaving little notes on their desks, only 3 apparently. Or is Nadine Dorries right that he's being Dickensian? Andrew.
I had a feeling you might come to me first. I actually side with Nadine on this one. I wouldn't go as far as to call Jacob Dickensian, although he would probably take that as a compliment.
Far too modern.
Quite. I think that we've now moved into this period that people are just much more expecting to be able to work in a much more flexible way. I think for young people getting started, that an office environment is a really good thing. And from an office environment, great ideas come. Bouncing ideas off of each other, talking at the water cooler, whatever it is. I think it's a really good place, especially if you're just getting into the world of work. But we are now in a sphere where people expect to be able to do, if they can, work from home on certain days of the week. So I think we've got to accept that.
But I think the point that Jacob is making is that in a lot of government departments, it's no days a week that they're spending in the office.
Yeah, and look, it's for that own individual department, as it is for each company to make the decision based on essentially productivity and value for, in our case, taxpayers' money.
All right, Debbie?
So I wouldn't put myself in Team Jacob or Nadine, but the principle...
I'm going to force you to.
The principle that working lives are changing has to be accepted. All the pandemic did is fast forward this, and we just need to learn. If people are doing the job that they're meant to do, then I don't see a problem about when and where they work.
So you are on Team Nadine?
The real issue is about this power imbalance, which I think is very much where Jacob comes from. This is about, this is the old school approach of having power over your employees, which I think is very distasteful.
Okay. Daniel.
Well, I'd be in very big trouble with my superiors if I aligned myself with a politician of any stripe.
You're on this programme to give opinions.
I'm going to give you my opinion. I'll tell you what we did. We had, I spent most of today with my eager team of corruption fighters at a retreat in East London. It's the first time I've had my whole team together in 2 years. And actually, they were absolutely giddy with excitement and the sense that, we've got here all of the things that we are missing. But what did we do? And the reason I'm not in either team is, I'm afraid, somewhere in the middle. We asked people what worked best for them, and we listened, and we asked ourselves as a leadership team, what is the office for? Why do we need to be together sometimes or all of the time? And that's been a very instructive process. And I think, as with many employers, I think we're still probably in the foothills of a journey of discovery here around what the world of work is going to look like post-pandemic.
Tim?
The thing to do if someone leaves a note on your desk saying, I came by and you weren't here, is to wait until that person themselves is out of their office and then leave a note on their desk saying, I got your note, but you weren't here. I'm a hypocrite on this because I've always tried to stay away from offices because I like the freedom to be able to just go and do stuff like I've done for the last few days. But equally, the thing with civil servants is I'm paying for them, so I want them to be miserable. I want to know they're working back-breaking hours on my behalf, and the idea of them being at home, that's what I should be doing.
And you will be.
Yeah.
Right, our fun text question at the end from Caleb in Leeds. Pubs are going to be allowed to stay open for an extra 2 hours for the Platinum Jubilee. How will your panel be celebrating that momentous day for the Queen? Right, that's enough time you've got to think about it. Daniel.
I can tell you exactly where I should be. I should be on the village green in the village that we have recently moved to, which requires a village collective to mow the green because it doesn't belong to anybody, and there are extensive plans to make the most of the arrangements on the green for the Platinum Jubilee.
And play cricket, hopefully. You can't get much more English than that.
Quite possibly. If it was me, it would be very badly played, but yes.
Tim?
I cannot think of a witty answer. All I can say is that I'm very glad I don't live in a country like North Korea where I'm expected to celebrate anyone or anything, and that's one of the things I've always liked about our royal family. It's a sort of it's something people nationally enjoy, but it's also private and privatized, and I'm sure I wouldn't be doing anything special because that's not expected of me, and she wouldn't expect me to do it. And if I turned up on her door with a bottle of wine, she wouldn't like that either.
It's possible. Debbie?
I'll be visiting my constituents. There are a number of different events going on across Oldham and Saddleworth, and I'll be visiting and celebrating with them.
Andrew?
On the Thursday, I'll be trooping the colour and then at a street party down here, and then heading up north in my constituency. I'm going to a couple of garden parties over the weekend.
I don't expect I'll be working. There you go. Listen, thank you all very much. Andrew Bowie, Debbie Abrahams, Tim Stanley and Daniel Bruce. We have another cross question with a top-class panel again tomorrow night from 8. Coming up in a moment, the Prime Minister has backed Jacob Rees-Mogg's back to the office push, which we've just been talking about. Andrew is already regretting his answer on that one. But Nadine Dorries has objected to his plans, saying there's a whiff of something Dickensian about it. Why are we measuring bodies behind desks? Why aren't we measuring productivity? That seems very, very sensible, doesn't it? Are you on Team Nadine or Team Jacob? 0345 6060 973. It's 3 minutes past 9.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, Elon Musk, the world's richest person, has agreed a deal to buy Twitter for more than £34 billion. The billionaire behind Tesla and SpaceX has been in talks to take over the platform outright after recently taking a stake in it. He's pledged to be more lenient when it comes to policing users' speech. LBC's technology correspondent Will Guyot says it's not clear yet what his wider plans for the site are.
He's already suggested there's going to be a paywall, so you might need to pay to see tweets from certain celebrities and public figures. Others are already speculating